about child welfare NGOs in post-Soviet Kazakhstan, and I'm going to examine the process of becoming policy actors and service providers over the last 25 years. Therefore, the objective of this presentation is to examine the effects of the transnational institutional environment on child welfare NGOs and development of social services, so personal social services and social work in post-Soviet Kazakhstan. And the questions that I am going to address are the following. Which, why, and when, why, and how did NGOs, domestic NGOs, newborn NGOs in Kazakhstan, did enter welfare provision? What institutional factors have influenced their evolution? And how successful are NGOs as service providers and policy actors in this country? My presentation draws upon my doctoral research, which was about the post-Soviet transformation of child welfare institutions in Kazakhstan. I used the case study design, and the level of analysis was on institutional environment, legislation, transnational global policy environment, and national policy environment, and organizations that are policy actors, including governmental organizations, NGOs, and transnational organizations. And my analysis is based on data that I got from key informant interviews conducted in over the summer of 2012 in Kazakhstan, and also a huge number of written materials, including laws, regulation, legislation, media discourse, policy and organizational documents, program documents, etc., and research. This is my theoretical framework which I use for this analysis. So this is a revised or modified welfare mix or welfare diamond, which allowed me to look into the role that different societal sectors play in welfare provision, including the state, NGOs, family, and transnational organizations. And obviously, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about NGOs, domestic NGOs. And I wanted to add my 5 cents to the debate about whether the Soviet state was a welfare state or not. I think it was. But in a way, of course, there were major differences, and it's hard actually to, it depends on the perspective, and of course there is no right or wrong answer. But if you think about welfare state as an organized power used to ensure independence from the market, then the Soviet state was definitely a welfare state, but in a way a total welfare state. And therefore, the post-Soviet welfare transformation in Kazakhstan and maybe other post-Soviet countries can be conceptualized as the emergence of the welfare diamond and the transformation of the total welfare state into some kind of welfare mix. When families now can get or are forced to get support from different sources, including the state, the market, informal support, and from also international organizations of foreign aid. So, because Diane already has covered a lot about the principles of child welfare organization in the Soviet Union, so I'm not going to talk much about that. I will just say that the main principle in Soviet welfare, child welfare provision was to use universal welfare programs, including universal income transfers or categorical cash transfers, also public social services such as education, healthcare, and subsidized childcare, And to those families that fail to provide care to their children, even with these universal programs, the main response of the Soviet child welfare system was children's residential institutions, which are numerous and continue to exist and actually very well maintained over the last 25 years in this region. And the important part is the social work, professional social work, and personal social services as a welfare institution were absent in the Soviet welfare system. And the explanation is kind of easy, because the logic was that since we address the roots of social problems, which were in the capitalist exploitation then and mode of production, that's why we don't really have social problems and we don't need social work. Okay, and now I'm going to move on to the transformation of child welfare, what actually happened in child welfare provisions using the welfare diamond or welfare mix approach. And I'm going to focus on two roughly defined phases in the development of child welfare or transformation of child welfare in Kazakhstan. So it's the first decade of independence and the second decade of independence. So what happened in the first decade of independence was described very well. So many of you know already that the GDP in Kazakhstan dropped by 40% and real wages fell by 50% in the early 1990s, and poverty was widespread, over 40% even using the existing very low poverty threshold in Kazakhstan. And there were also new categories of poor people and vulnerable groups emerging in that time. And families with children, single-parent families, or families, large families with several children were particularly vulnerable in that time. Okay, and that's the picture of a child in the market in Almaty. Okay, and what about state? What did state do in that first decade of independence? The focus of the state was mostly on economic restructuring and political reform or democratization. And in terms of welfare, the main direction that welfare change was taking was welfare retrenchment. So in a way, the austerity measures that now are very much widespread all over Europe and in the Western world. Actually, the austerity measures were very early introduced in the post-Soviet and post-socialist region. And in Kazakhstan, there were major cuts in welfare and public programs and public services. Social services were done just to try to balance the budget. However, children residential institutions did survive because that was the only response to the need. So what was happening with NGOs? NGOs were emerging in the early 1990s as a result of the government democratization reforms, democracy reforms. And the law that gave the beginning, opened the doors to domestic NGOs in Kazakhstan was the law on public associations. And very soon after the adoption of the law, hundreds and thousands of NGOs were formed in Kazakhstan. What was interesting that NGOs during that period were largely supported by international organizations, transnational organizations through their foreign aid, and foreign aid was transferred to NGOs as part of Western governments' support to civil society and democratization in the post-Soviet region. That's why NGOs were largely shaped by the assistance provided by transnational organizations in that time. So the interesting thing to me is that although NGOs were constructed as political organizations, as political actors, as a representation of political pluralism and democratization, many of them, or some of them, or at least child welfare NGOs that I'm focusing on, were interested in providing social support to those who were left vulnerable and unprotected. And this is the example of several prominent NGOs that still continue to work in this area, child welfare NGOs. For instance, RD is the Association of Parents of Children with Disabilities. So the organization started very early in 1991, I think, because the parents of children who have disabilities needed to organize some kind of support to these families, and that was their response to the need. And the same can be said about other organizations here. The transnational organizations that influence the development of child welfare NGOs were not a homogeneous force, because there were numerous international organizations working in this region, including organizations that were directly interested in child welfare issues such as UNICEF or IFEAC, but also there were organizations, transnational organizations, that were mostly interested in the support of civil society. So what was happening was that NGOs, child welfare NGOs, were able to access resources and funding provided to civil society by framing child welfare support and support to families using the human rights and child rights frameworks. And this is what allowed them to exist and to actually channel that kind of foreign assistance into social support to families and children. So now I'm moving to the second decade of independence. And what was happening then was the economy of this country started to improve. And I call this period of time the revival of social welfare, and social policy moved to the center of the state agenda at the time as part of the state overall agenda of political consolidation of different political forces in Kazakhstan. At the same time, the idea of government funding of NGOs emerged among different policy actors, including NGOs who were looking for some kind of recognition from the state. And also transnational organizations were promoting this idea of state government of NGOs as social service providers, because they wanted to reduce the dependence of NGOs on foreign aid. And at the same time, the government, the state was looking to increase social control and to engage by engaging NGOs into the provision of social services. So the revival of welfare in general and the revival of social policy in general in Kazakhstan was also translated into the revival of child welfare, because children were considered as one of the main categories of beneficiaries within the new welfare agenda. And that's why several new pieces of legislation were adopted at that time, and I'm not even covering them, and I'm not talking about multiple programs and multiple new institutions that were introduced during that time that were focusing on the issues of child welfare. But just to summarize what was happening as a result of the introduction of new pieces of legislation was that child welfare NGOs now framed as important social service providers were able to access public resources using these new institutional mechanisms. Okay, and that's a picture of RD, the Association of Parents of Children with Disabilities. So the organization was doing numerous activities beginning in 1991, but since 2008 or 2009, after the introduction of the law on special social services, this organization and its daycare center, which provides social services, a range of social services to families and children with special needs, this organization is able to actually access government funding and to provide those services continuously. Which sounds very much like a success story. So now I have very little time, so I'm going to just get back to my original questions. And the question was when, why, and how did NGOs enter welfare provision, and whether they are successful as policy actors and social service providers. Okay, so that's my summary of my findings about NGOs. So my analysis identified two phases in the development of child welfare NGOs. During the first phase, the issue of concern was the most pressing needs of children and families affected by the economic crisis and the withdrawal of Soviet social welfare programs. And the type of work that NGOs did was emergency relief, humanitarian assistance, awareness raising, fundraising, provision of social support, and resources used were mostly drawn from transnational organizations and also from private sources. And the role in the policy process was mostly the role of outsiders, advocates, and critics of the state, while social service provision wasn't the priority on the agenda. So what was happening during the second decade was that, of course, new social problems crystallized in this area, in the area of child welfare, such as social inequality, new poor, the needs for social services, education, special education for children with special needs. And the types of work that NGOs have moved to are now the provision of social services, educational services, special education, research, policy analysis, recommendations, and law drafting. The resources that they are now able to access are coming from the state, transnational organizations, although that foreign aid has significantly reduced after 2005, but also from private sources. And the role of NGOs in the policy process has become more of insiders. They do policy analysis, they are part of consultation groups, they give recommendations for specific change in existing institutions. Okay, and this is my last slide. So my conclusion is that what can you say based on this analysis about the transformation of NGOs, child welfare NGOs? First of all, NGOs influenced by the transnational institutional environment have developed as flexible, open, adaptable organizations able to learn, adopt, and translate international ideas and design and implement innovative programs. At the same time, NGOs' capacity to provide continuous, reliable support social services for target populations continues to be limited due to unreliable short-term funding, the lack of organizational support built in the institutional mechanisms of money allocation, and the lack of resources to keep skilled staff. Okay, thank you so much.